Hi, I'm David,
I'm Peyton.
and this is Shortening, episode 2. So we take short stories and we make them equal length or shorter through discussion. So sort of a read-along companion to the short stories that we talk about. This week is Question Mark by Randall Munroe. So I'll give a little bit of a background on what the story is, why I picked it, and then Peyton and I will talk about some of our thoughts and takeaways.
So now is a good chance to read the story if you haven't. If you press the pause button on your phone, we will wait very patiently for you to complete it, and then you can return.
All right, I think they probably waited enough. So back to Question Mark by Randall Munroe. Also, if you're trying to look for this story online, look for Machine of Death, because Google does not identify single character story names that are punctuation. So yeah, back into the context for the story. So there's a whole group of short stories that have one unified theme, which is that there is a machine that can predict when people die, typically in a slip of paper or some other means, but it will be a written description of how someone will die. So this story is a man who you just sort of you cut into the story already moving, and this person is driving around. They have stolen a car, they're moving over to another stolen car, and then they are setting fires along the way. And the story kind of cuts out with a personal reflection from the narrator. So that's a really quick context. Not talking about why I picked this one. I really like Randall Munroe's work. He's the author of XKCD, and he also writes other novels, Thing Explainer and What If. And I remember reading the whole set of Machine of Death stories and finding them interesting because it was hearing an idea presented in so many different forms really had an interesting flavor to it. You had all these authors exploring this concept. I will say that this story is probably best read with a few others from the anthology because it makes some assumptions about how the world works and the idea of this machine that predicts people's death. So I picked it mostly on that. Peyton, what did you think of it?
I think you're right that reading it along with other stories in the anthology helps. The only other shared premise anthology that I've read was Wasteland, and each of the short stories in anthologies that share a premise do make some assumptions about the world that the reader already knows about. And people, when they're writing for these anthologies, they're reached out to and told, this is the premise, you will be in an anthology with this premise. So the writers already are assuming, and they know whether they'll be the first story or not. I read the Wasteland anthology series, which is about apocalypses, and it's right that contrasting them is very interesting. Stephen King and Octavia Butler have very different ideas of what the apocalypse looks like. This story, I thought, it's a short one, and it's a quick read, and it's very, very focused on a single idea, on a single feeling, which I appreciate. I did feel I saw Randall Munroe's essayist in the prose a little bit.
Yeah, I think that it was a very, very short read, and it was almost a thesis. It was a singular sort of thought that was then manifested, but I felt the underlying ideologies that would lead to the character's motivation and sort of the world behind it. It was sort of that to me felt the richness of the world was the set of actions that would lead to someone causing harm and chaos and honestly just this massive act of frustration, setting fires in a huge question mark as a sort of protest to the environment. Talk about the this wasn't a recent introduction of the machine. Some of the other stories would explore the machine is introduced and how is this affecting our world. This was someone who had been living in this environment, feeling constrained and almost just futilely protesting against fate or predeterminism. So I liked that the actions that the character took were so extreme because it also reflected the impact of living in that predetermined world. So it was short, but I felt it was pretty dense in terms of its message and the intensity. It was like a firework, very short but impactful.
Yes, I think it was very sincere. I related being an engineer and spending a lot of my career working with math and very impersonal but predictable systems. I related to what I perceived as basically Randall Munroe inserting himself into this world and then explaining exactly how he would feel, because this machine, it prints out the pieces of paper that say you are going to die in this way, and it's never explicit, but it's implied that people, when they get their sheet of paper, they're going to die very soon, and they often respond to this sheet of paper by trying to change their behavior. If it says they're going to die in a truck, they never get in a truck again. And maybe they die because a truck flips over and the door is open and it encloses them in a car accident. So they were actually in their sedan, but they're also in a truck, and then they die. This is it's never explicit, but that's kind of implied what's happening. And as if you're a physicist or you work with rigid systems in any way, you do have this objection to any belief that's a little too narrative in the world. Things, you got sick because of something with your relationship with nature or something. Any kind of animistic belief just feels a little strange and convenient and a little too human thought. Word games definitely require, as he's arguing, lingual cognition, and the story is told with prose description interwoven with dialogue, which is actually monologue. It took me a little bit to figure out that it was actually just monologue. And it felt like the monologue was an essay, really just an essay. And the prose is interesting interwoven with it, but I stopped short of purchasing this story. I don't know how else to say it, in that I just couldn't escape that it was not removed from the real world enough. It felt a little too real.
I would buy that. I think that there's an intensity, and there's actions that are being performed, and those actions are, there's one action being taken, right? There's the drawing of the giant question mark in fire, and there's all of the actions that are sort of related to that thing being done, and then there's the character's thoughts, but you're just sort of seeing those things unfold. It to me, it actually, now that you mention it, reminds me a lot of a great Netflix series called Midnight Gospel, where there's
all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's excellent. But as you mentioned it really reminds me of that same concept where there's, for folks who haven't seen it, it's almost a philosophical dialogue taking place between characters typically, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the animation, which you can watch and it adds some flavor to what you're hearing, and it adds a little bit of context, but it's unnecessary. And I think that a lot of the physical interactions told in the story of, I broke into the window and I hope there weren't kids hurt in that fire that I set, but it's not really my actions, it's the actions of the divine creator who has inspired me in this way because of the paper and everything. These aren't my actions anymore. All those felt like just sort of they were complements to the core idea, but they weren't necessary. So you mentioned the essay and then there's details woven in. I would agree. They feel kind of stapled together. They aren't as wholly consistent.
One of the pieces of prose that I thought worked really well with the essay and actually provided some interesting illustrations of the point of the essay was this sentence when he was hot wiring a car. It says, he fumbled around with the wires under the steering wheel, hoping that there would be an obvious pair of wires labeled, connect these to hot wire car. But in the end, he had to pry the ignition apart and turn the rotator switch to start the car. And I thought that was a great illustration of the point, which is that the world mechanically does not understand human intent or human understanding of outcomes. Everything in the world that behaves according to human intent does so because someone took the time to think on the system's terms and then build something that realizes human intent through it. And because that's the case, well, what is this machine?
I felt there was that even the intention of, I wish these two wires I could see them connected. I feel like there was an abdication of responsibility for his actions that, at least to me, felt super clear towards the end of the story. Curious to hear what you think of it, but it almost felt like his decision to sort of go on this catharsis, massive scale catharsis is the only way I could describe it. It's not a rampage. It's not ill intent. It just feels the only actions that he could take. To me, it felt like there's a lot of, I'm not really the one doing this, or I'm not responsible for these things. I'm just sort of executing the only thing that I could imagine doing in this situation.
Okay, actually, I did not think of that.
Okay.
As I was reading through it, the whole time I was just, yeah, I mean, I guess this is what you have to do. So that's an interesting point, and I guess I kind of wonder why I never thought that there could be an alternative.
Can I tell you why? Tell you why I thought that?
Yeah, tell me why.
This is a good transition to what I wanted to get your thoughts on too, which was the last line in the story, or something. The last line where he's talking about the paper, what is going to be written on the paper, because you find out he hasn't looked at it, which is
I can read it if you want.
Oh yeah, that would be great if you have it.
Yeah, his last line in the monologue to the machine, which he assumes is omniscient, is about the paper that he hasn't read. It says, but if you have even a bit of honesty in you, the paper in my pocket doesn't say suicide. It says murder. And this is after he explains his intent to lay on this rock and not seek food or water.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, to me, that was the line that connected the machine as sort of controlling everything about my life. And so this isn't even my choice anymore. The fact that it's not suicide, it is murder. I was killed by the system that we are in right now and the machine. So that was kind of the abdication of responsibility line in my mind, where he wasn't even really making this choice. It was, you did this to me, and I'm this is all that I can do in response to the environment that you've created.
So there's no indication in the story how long there is between getting the paper and your death. And I think because of this attitude and how dramatically he was reacting to it, I assumed that if you got the paper, it was okay, today. It's ending today, and this is just how. But this would be a dramatically different character and reaction if, when you got the paper, it was a variable amount of time. Everyone gets the paper at 20, and then it could be, yeah, you'll die tomorrow, or you'll die at 75. and you just don't know until you read the paper. Well, that would be very different. I didn't read any other stories in the anthology, so maybe you could tell me what you think is the case with that.
Yeah, I was deciding between this one and another story actually, but where the papers behaved exactly as you described. They just had the cause of death, but you didn't know if it was in the future, or you didn't know how far off it was.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I was coming at it from that lens where there's no aspect of time or urgency to the paper. It is just the fact that it is predetermined that then basically affects the world. So all the stuff that you described about the truck and the avoiding the truck and all that, these would be things in other stories that were explored where you would see people change their behavior radically, try to do everything to avoid it. And that created, then it became almost this puzzle where the author would try to create those scenarios like the truck one that you mentioned, where they took a really interesting way of dying, and then they would weave a story where the person did everything that they could, and then the grand reveal would be like the truck case, that they are then in this thing. But the timescales were variable. So I think I was coming at it from that lens where, yeah, it wasn't, this story felt more urgent than other ones, but wasn't, yeah, I think I was looking at it from the lens of him seeking the paper as a redemption of his actions, because if it says murder, then he's not responsible for it, and if it said suicide, then theoretically he is.
Okay, so this does change the way that I feel about it, even though it shouldn't. If it's not when, then it doesn't seem so reasonable to rage against the universe. But we're generally, I don't know why it makes more sense, but if you know that you're going to die soon, then we generally forgive you for having an existential crisis, because that's something that most of us get the luxury to ignore a lot of the time or forget about for periods of time. He could have just burned up the paper and gone on living his life the way that we in the real world do. I think one of the reasons that I saw it as more of an essay was that the personification of the machine doesn't really change the nature of it that much to me. If the real world operates according to deterministic laws, then that also predestines everyone to death. It's just they're not reading the paper because we haven't figured out, basically we haven't built the physics simulations to read the paper yet. And it doesn't, yeah, it just doesn't feel so different from real life. And I mean, I guess that's just because all speculative fiction is an allegory for the world you're in. It kind of gives a personification to the feeling that we actually already do have of, I don't want to die, I'm going to die. It's predetermined how, and free will, sure, mechanistically it doesn't work, but it doesn't really change the fact that if you stop believing in your own free will, if you stop subscribing to the illusion of it, it makes you feel worse. It makes you a worse person. You can't control your actions, but yeah, it's very strange. I mean, there's no way that you can really persuade yourself that you aren't in control of your actions, at least without surgically altering some part of your brain.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like that struggle around the edges of free will, whether or not he could have lived his life normally, which it depends, right? Because you're now in a new system where everyone theoretically knows how they die, and so you're going against the grain by not knowing. But there are other stories that explore that.
Yeah.
I think the certainty that things were predestined is that's the, if there's a bit that's flipped between that universe and this one, the one that we inhabit now, that to me was sort of the seed that sort of grew. We don't know how long he had the paper or anything else, but I guess in my mind, I was imagining this was one of those things where it's similar to any other sort of like crises. If it's a midlife crisis, the slow realization of the inefficacy of the actions that are being taken, or the fact that what people are setting out to achieve, they aren't necessarily achieving. All those little influences.
So he
I
could
think
be
this
like
is just sort of
45 and he got the paper when he graduated high school, and now
right.
it's, yeah, I see.
And this is his breaking point. We're just because we're thrown into this story. I think we're just, yeah, this could have been burning a hole in his pocket for most of his life, and now he can't take it anymore. So that's kind of, I saw this as a snap moment for him more than an instantaneous got the reading and went on a rampage. Like there was some calculation in this. Even the decision to go on these, set all the fires and make a question mark. I think that there's an intentionality to that would be hard to imagine being an instant thing.
Yeah.
So that's the way I interpreted it. Yeah.
It does introduce to everyone evidence, sort of undeniable evidence that they are not in control of their actions, and
at some level. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's an odd thing to say, but I suppose what humans really care about in terms of free will is not, or the important point regarding it and how it influences a culture is not whether it's real, because real or not, the system we're living in already exists. It's just whether everyone believes they're in control or not. And yeah, you were saying earlier that this is someone who is absolving themselves of responsibility for their actions. And
that's the way I read it anyway. I think it was even the decision to burn the question mark was just a macro level act of utility and frustration that isn't designed to achieve anything outside of some sort of internal catharsis that they've done it's doing in an environment where there's no way to affect things. To me, it was a facsimile of taking action, right? Rather than just sitting there, biting their nails, feeling it's going to come someday. This was the most that he could do to respond to it versus just let it hang over him like a cloud.
I do feel like it would be difficult to live in a world where you're presented with the evidence of your predestination so intimately. There's a letter given to you, because I feel like the only way to cope with the knowledge of determinism in real life is to have a kind of double think about it, where you believe in, you subscribe to the idea of free will in your own life, in your personal relationships. But when you're designing a society in a macro scale, and you get this data that suggests if you put people in this situation, they make this decision, you do get a lens that, the brain works a certain way, and you can't even really describe what the free will process would be in a way that makes sense. Is it a random process? Is it a deterministic process? Is it a mix of both? Neither are particularly satisfying according to your intuition for your own sense of self-direction. So on a macro scale, I feel like you do have to think about it as humans are machines. We want to maximize the well-being of the machines, and the micro and macro perspectives are in conflict, but physics does the same thing. They use one model for the big stuff, one model for the small stuff. Some double think is required. They can be
conflicting, right? They can be conflicting. Even in physics, all the physics models break down when you get to a quantum scale. You actually just they don't apply anymore.
Yeah, and classic gravity is very wrong, but that's a good model. It helps.
It's good enough.
It gets you by. You in order to cope, you have to accept that you're just going to have to settle for models of things, and you're not going to get certainty or a consistent understanding of, set the universe aside, you're not going to get a consistent understanding of yourself. And now, I actually didn't have any of these thoughts when I read it the first time, but since you've been pointing these out, I'm kind of looking at it as a story of someone who is, they're looking at this certainty that the machine has. It has somehow this lingual cognition, also an understanding of physics sufficient to predict all outcomes, and it maybe it's kind of envy, angry, indignant envy that someone else has the certainty that this person desperately wants.
It's interesting. I had not thought that before, but I think that envy and I would definitely say desire. There's such a massive unfulfilled desire that kind of courses through this story for, I mean, even for answers, right? The question mark itself. I think, yeah, there's the question mark is why? What, looking for some of that certainty. So I think I could see envy. I was definitely feeling desire and some of these coveting emotions that either for the machine itself or just, yeah, the ability to get a more complete picture of the world that isn't going to be on that paper. So I had a couple accolades for the story, a couple tags. One of the ones that came to mind was it's got really vivid conceptual imagery. So the idea of this burning question mark being scorched into the earth in sort of a macro scale.
Yeah.
I felt that imagery was really well done. Yeah. Did you have any accolades for the story?
For this one, it's a strange one maybe, because it doesn't sound like praise, but I think it kind of is. I'll start with the criticism first. The criticism is that I felt like I recognized some writing techniques in it. The first sentence that says he hadn't looked at the piece of paper in his pocket yet is, and then the not telling me what it was for pages and pages was sort of a transparent hook that made me irritated that I wasn't getting something delivered to me, an answer. The dialogue, which was actually a monologue, was difficult to determine was a monologue. I had to reread a couple pages because I thought that there were two people, but the dialogue blocks kept agreeing with each other. So it took a couple of rereads to figure out that was happening. So I didn't like those, but the praise that I have for it is that at the end of it, I didn't feel very good. Yeah. But I felt fine before I read the story.
So it had an effect on. So it was a moving piece.
Yeah.
I see. I guess that's better than an ineffective piece for
right.
this type of a story.
Yeah.
I'll take it. If you're looking for, curious what other folks thought, but this is a good story to make you feel deeply troubled in ways that are hard to describe. And it's probably, for folks who like this story and want more, there are a couple more stories in the anthology that I would recommend. One of them has kind of a messed up name that I don't want to turn people off of on it, but it's in the anthology. It's by Yahtzee Crashaw, and it has the worst name of any story in the book, but I would highly recommend reading it just because it's humorous and dark at the same time, and it also raises some existential woes that a lot of the stories in the anthology have.
And if you liked this story, you may like other stories of our selection. Maybe you like our taste. Check back for future episodes. We will have the story that should be read before the podcast, always in the title, and we'll discuss it similar to how we discussed this one.
All right, take care and feel free to read the next story, which will be, and you can eat some sliced up bananas on top of some peanut butter toast while you read it. Take care.
We'll see you at the next shortening. Prepare for your truncation.
Trying closing line.
Thanks to Ryan, that's RHYNE @Ryan Music, for the use of our theme song, KunieMix. See you next time.